wouldn't it just be easier to give some concessions? To give Israel a slap on the wrist and make them stop the worst of their atrocities for at least a little while? This is not how world leaders, fascists, and oligarchs think.
What slap on the wrist does he want? No, he doesn't know. He doesn't know that Biden was actually, in part, the one that secured aircraft carriers going into the Mediterranean to make sure that Israel and Hezbollah wouldn't go straight to war from October 8th onwards. That Biden has been repeatedly falling out with Netanyahu over humanitarian issues in Gaza, and he has actually been pressuring Israel to allow humanitarian aid in a way that it didn't seem like they were up for doing before. No, he doesn't know any of that. He doesn't give a f*** about it. He doesn't care. Alright, second thoughts got a new Palestine video. What happens when evil wins?
This episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon.
Oh.
Get some cool perks and help support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. I also recently launched a new channel dedicated to the nuts and bolts of making a living as a creative. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can check it out at the link below.
Holy shit, it's good editing.
All right, I'm back with the lo-fi setup again. This is one of those topics where I don't want to be a professional presenter. I just want to talk to you as a human being who's been watching the worst images I've seen in my life over the past few months and try to work through some of it. On October 7th, 2023, the Palestinian resistance took the fight to the Israeli occupation and knocked the wind out of them a little bit. For those who somehow aren't aware of the situation in Gaza,
and which you supported. Yeah, which you were very happy for them to do. And then said that the people that they killed weren't civilians because their ancestors or even just different people from that area did crimes. Yes. Okay. I don't know what he thought was gonna. I don't know what he thought was gonna happen next. I don't understand that. Like, I'm still not quite sure. Usually when you support some kind of violent action, you're expecting some kind of outcome from it. Where's the thing? Just in case we don't know.
Loner box, you smarmy
bastard. This it?
This Dono is a J down.
Huh.
Sent files also very much. He says, did the Palestinians actually take civilian hostage, or is that fake news?
Loner box,
I don't care.
The occupiers
I
are
don't-
not civilians. That is what it comes down to. Like, if imagine, like if
Sorry, go on.
Germany, let's say Germany, to be non-controversial, invaded the United States, and they said, you know what, Cincinnati, Ohio is our ancestral home, and everyone knows that's blatantly false. But they take your home, they murder your grandma, they bulldoze like your neighbor's house. Are those people civilians there? No, they're occupiers, and those are criminals. Yeah. That is, there are no civilians there in the illegal military occupation.
Yeah. So that's number one, very beautifully put. Number two, much more importantly, the track record of.
That's also it's so stupid. Like the only charitable, with the fact that he says illegal military occupation in there, which means it sounds like he's talking about the West Bank, unless he just considers all of Israel to be an illegal military occupation. It's funny that the most charitable interpretation you can have of what he just said is that he's insanely ignorant, that he just saw the news headline and thought Hamas had crossed from Gaza somehow to attack settlers in the West Bank. That's like the only charitable interpretation you can have of what he's saying, is that he's just insanely fucking stupid. Like, I don't know.
Palestinians has been 1,000 times better than that of the Israeli occupation, despite the fact that Israeli occupation does not need to brutalize. They already have all the power.
Yeah.
But they still choose to do far worse. The worst that will happen to a person in Palestinian custody is that they're going to be like auctioned off for a prisoner swap, which is the historic track record also.
Yeah. I guess we know that wasn't true either, but okay, let's see.
To a brutal and genocidal occupation for 3/4 of a century. It's a long story, and if you'd like to hear more of it, we put out a First Thought analysis episode a while back that covers the history of Israel and the beginning of...
Again, like a genocidal occupation for 3/4 of a century. That works if you think Israel is like its existence is a brutal genocidal occupation. Like, because they weren't occupying Gaza and the West Bank until 1967, so... It's not quite 3/4 of a century unless you think all of Israel counts. But
their ethnic cleansing campaign. We also did a deprogram episode with the wonderful people who run decolonizepalestine.com, and another good resource is Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Pappé is an Israeli historian, so before you go accusing me of only suggesting pro-Palestine sources...
No, wait, f off. Everyone knows Pappé is a pro-Palestinian. Because his ethnicity is Israeli? Because he was born in Israel? That's why? No, he is a pro-Palestinian historian. This entire book, the entire role of the Palestinian in this book is that they do nothing. They are just passive, polite villagers who are very hospitable and who fought bravely when they were attacked by genocidal Israeli Zionist forces. That's the Pappé story. You don't learn anything about what even though it's called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, you don't learn anything about the role of the Arab leaders in that time. You don't learn anything about al-Husseini's role. Actually, I think he actually just brushes off al-Husseini's role and blames it on I think he blames the Arab revolt and the Jerusalem riots and all that shit. I think he just blames it on British imperialism in this book. There's also a line at the end that I think is very, very... There's one example. I'll show you one example of this book where it's so clear, it's very illustrative of just his entire approach to the entire conflict. It's when you look at the part when he's talking about Rabin. This is just at the end, his sort of after the ethnic cleansing, and him just talking briefly about the post-48 period. So here he's talking about Rabin and Arafat. And if you look at the way he just sums up this area here, he says Israel's peace axioms were rearticulated during the days of Yitzhak Rabin, the same Yitzhak Rabin who, as a young officer, had taken an active part in the 1948 cleansing, but who had now been elected as prime minister on a platform that promised the resumption of the peace effort. Rabin's death, he was assassinated by one of his own people on the 4th of November 1995, came too soon for anyone to assess how much he had really changed from his 48 days. As recently as 1987, as Minister of Defense, he had ordered his troops to break the bones of Palestinians who confronted his tanks with stones in the First Intifada. He had deported hundreds of Palestinians as Prime Minister prior to the Oslo Agreement, and he had pushed for the 1994 Oslo B Agreement that effectively caged the Palestinians in the West Bank into several Bantustans. So first of all, this break the bones thing is a little bit dubious. I know a lot of people say it. It seems to me that the evidence for it is that an Israeli officer or an Israeli military person did actually say break their bones, and they were actually put on trial for it. And in their trial, they said that it was acceptable from the top down. It was Rabin's orders, basically. But it seems to be that all we know about Rabin's orders is that he had told his troops to move away from live ammunition and towards using clubs to deal with violent protesters, as a way of to stop people from dying. So you can take it or leave it. Maybe Rabin said break their bones, according to this one person who was on trial. But it's pretty, I think the evidence for this is pretty weak in the context of it. But was it not punished? Well, again, this one person was actually on trial, and he said that he felt betrayed. That is a legitimate criticism, though. The legit criticism you can make is that people dealt with the First Intifada in a disproportionate and incredibly violent way were not properly prosecuted. But that's obviously not the same as he ordered his troops to break the bones of Palestinians, right? It's also assuming the only people who were throwing stones were throwing them at tanks and not slingshotting stones at people, or dropping fucking bricks from the top of buildings, which I think, did that happen in the First or the Second Intifada? I forgot. But yeah, it's just the language here is so, and you'll never hear anything in this whole section about Arafat's role from 64 onwards, about how Arafat's role was basically to try and destroy all of Israel and to achieve their political ends by launching terror attacks on civilians, by attacking buses full of Israeli civilians, or by attacking people over the border. So you'll never hear about that part, even though we're learning about the peace process here with Rabin and Arafat, because always with the Israeli side, you have to use all the right language to make it look as barbaric and as comically evil as possible. And for the Palestinians, you just don't say anything. For Arafat, you don't say anything about what he was doing. Even though we'll talk about what Rabin was doing in 48, when he did actually order the biggest expulsion of the war, but you'll never read anything about what Arafat was doing from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. None of it. And that's the gist of this entire book. It's not like, I wouldn't say never read it, because there are some bits in it that I think you won't get from other places. Like I think Pape was actually ahead of the curve with noticing that there were Israeli orders, I think, from kind of like the middle down to poison the wells with typhoid in Accra and in Gaza. Is it Accra or Acre? I don't know. But yeah, that was actually a thing. And that was a thing that other historians didn't pick up on until 2021, when the documents were released on it. And it turned out he was right. So there are a few, and you can also hear the details of how the actual, like the direct expulsions worked on the 55 villages that were directly expelled by Jewish forces. And the way that they did that was basically how they would have lists of people who were participants in the Arab Revolt who didn't get prosecuted. They would get killed. Sometimes they would get killed. And then for the rest of them, they would order them to flee, to leave the village. And then they would fire gunshots over their heads if they refused, or to speed them up, basically. So you do learn a bit here, but if this is going to be like your comprehensive understanding of the 48 war, or the rest of this is going to be the conflict, you are just going to have this assumption that Israel is like this like comically, exceptionally brutal regime in the context of like even just like the rest of the world, just completely one-sidedly like brutalizing and massacring and cleansing and genociding a passive, peaceful population, which is just not really how it went down. It's a very, very simplified, like kind of dishonest way of framing the entire story. But anyway. He also does mangle a few quotes in a bit of a dishonest way as well, like the one with Ben Gurion's letter to his son about like, we must remove the Arabs and we'll use a war as the opportune moment to do so, which again is not really how the expulsion evolved over time. It was more of like an evolved process throughout the war. But anyway, yeah. So no, I wouldn't contrast Pape with a pro-Palestinian just because he's ethnically Israeli. That's really stupid. That's so dumb. Anyway.
Also did a deprogram episode with the wonderful people who run decolonizepalestine.com. And another good resource is Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Pape is an Israeli historian, so before you go accusing me of only suggesting pro-Palestine sources, maybe give that one a read. You can find all these things linked in the description. For those who can't be bothered, here's a very short summary of what led up to this point. As anti-Semitism flared up in Europe in the midst of the world wars, we also saw the development of the political Zionist movement, which was basically a push to establish a Jewish ethno-state somewhere in the world. That should have been the first red flag. Ethno-states aren't generally a good thing. You might be surprised to learn that Palestine was not the only option on the list. There were multiple other locations considered, on different continents, and all of those places were already occupied. As the evil of fascism threatened Jewish people in Europe...
There's also something I think a bit snaky about saying just like Jewish ethno-state, because when people say ethno-state, what they really think, it always invokes the idea of white nationalism. That's usually the first example of an ethno-state that people learn about, is this idea of like white people wanting to ethnically purify their nation, or they say like London isn't British enough, or like America is becoming too diverse and white people will be a minority. But the problem there is you have a power majority group that is fearing multiculturalism with very little justification. They might try to cite like crime stats kind of dubiously, or like they might try to go for these crazy stories about like grooming gangs and shit like that, but it's very irrational. It's like a very like born out of xenophobia. Whereas the Jewish rationale for wanting a Jewish state was kind of legitimate at the time. Like obviously the choosing a place that was already populated was kind of fucking horrible, but the idea that they wanted an ethno-state, because for some reason, I guess like this substantial portion of Jewish people in the 1870s decided that they were going to be like ethno-fascist. Like that's not really the case. No, they wanted it because of persecution, because they felt like living as a sparse community around the Muslim world, and especially the European world, was resulting in them getting pogromed and killed. So again, that morally loaded language is very silly, I think.
And to a lesser extent, the rest of the world, political Zionism won a certain amount of perceived legitimacy, especially among the British elite. In 1948, with the violent support of the British military, the State of
It
Israel...
would be like, and I think they understand this as well, because it would be like saying that fucking Algerians who wanted the French settler population to leave were ethno-staters. I mean, they kind of were, but like, okay, like, not in an unjustified way, probably not. I don't know.
elite. Political Zionism threatened Jewish people in Europe, and to a lesser extent, the rest of the world. Political Zionism won a certain amount of perceived legitimacy, especially among the British elite. In 1948, with the violent support of the British military, the State of Israel was founded on stolen Palestinian land.
Again, this thing as well with the violent support of the British military. Does this retard not know that Sorry. Does this guy not know, this person not know that the British had very much turned against Zionism in large part since the Arab Revolt in the late 30s? Does this guy not know that the British fought against Zionist forces in the 48 war? They fought against the Irgun in and around Jaffa. There were certain villages where they were fighting against them as well. Like they even at one point, when Israel was advancing towards Gaza and Britain was worried that they were going to advance into the Sinai, because I'll give you a map just to show you what had happened. I think it was Operation Yoav when they did this. Israel Palestine map. All right. So during Operation Yoav, what had happened was the Zionist forces had advanced down here, and they came around here and actually cut off Rafah from Gaza as well. So Gaza was closed in, and the Egyptian forces who were there were basically fucked. And they were actually pushing across the border in this area as well. And because Britain had an interest in the Suez Canal, they were really, really anxious about that, because they were actually fearing a Zionist advance all the way towards the Suez Canal. And Britain, in response to that, by the way, also Britain, who had an arms embargo up on both the Jews and the Arabs, were also threatening to resume and to they were threatening to resume arming the Arab armies because of that. Like, Britain and the Zionists were not friends at this point. The violent support of the Brit, and again, I guess he's obviously not going to mention the fact that very clearly the Arabs, and you can say it's justified or not. Like, I mean, I think it probably was justified, but the Arabs the Arabs wanted a war. The Arab leadership wanted a war. The surrounding Arab states wanted a war, because when the UN offered the partition plan, roughly based on like populations and just what was negotiated at the time, they wanted a war. The Zionists accepted this, the Arabs rejected it, and then they had a civil war. And then they had a real war with 5 different armies coming from different ends. So it's just such a, when you say this, like, that with the help of none of that content. What was the sentence again, summing up that history?
Perceived legitimacy, especially among the British elite. In 1948, with the violent support of the British military, the State of Israel was founded on stolen Palestinian land. And it's important to note here that stolen land doesn't mean unoccupied space. It's not like the locals were going, "Ooh, you stole my empty patch of dirt." No. The European invaders forced...
See, that summary is so horrible. Like, as far as support that Israel had at this time, they had support from financial support from different international Jewish organizations. I think Golda Meir actually managed to get quite a lot of funding from American Jews. She went to America expecting to raise, just before the war, she went to America expecting to raise $25 million for arms to prepare for the war. She came back with 50 million and then actually did another fundraiser and got about as much again. So they had a lot of arms, but the arms that they got came from Czechoslovakia, not from the United States. Like, the British, if you want to say the British were arming them to some degree, especially out of World War II, well, yeah, but then the Jordanians were armed quite well by the British as well. I think there were actually British people in the Jordanian forces that were fighting against the Israelis. So, no, but again, this obviously people like Second Thought have to assume with the violent support of the British military in that really, really grossly simplified way, is because they want to push the idea of Israel as a settler colonial project, like an imperial project. So settlers, yeah, they did do that. They were settling. They called themselves colonial to some degree because they were establishing those settlements and buying up that land from wealthy Arabs, by the way, from wealthy Arabs. Some of them, a lot of them actually nationalists. They were selling the land to these people, but they were buying those settlements and strategically buying them in certain areas so that they could connect them and form a state. They were doing that. But when you try to say imperial, you have to invoke the idea of a mother state. And here, I guess Second Thought has just kind of like shoehorned in the mother state being the British, which in 1948, they were absolutely not. If people try to make the argument, and actually I learned this quite recently, the idea of Israel being like settler colonialism, I think it originates from, who's the guy's name? Settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf? But the problem with this term, particular settler colonialism, is that it implies that you need a mother state. Like that's this theory generally, yeah, organized or supported by an imperial authority. But for Israel, you don't really have the British and the French in the same way that you do with British imperialism in like Kenya or South Africa, or French imperialism in Algeria, or the Germans in, was it Namibia? You don't really have that same clear imperial mother state. But I think the theorist who came up with this idea for Israel, Patrick Wolf, I'm pretty sure their mother state that they add in here is the international Jew, because that's really the only thing you can have that closely approximates a mother state, which is kind of actually why people make the argument that calling Israel settler colonialism is anti-Semitic, because they substitute a mother state with an international Jew, which sounds kind of like they did get some funding, but overall they did not have the financial support of a state, of a mother imperial state. So, anyway, God, I feel like you can go on for so long about how one sentence is just so grossly misinformed and misinforming. Ugh.
Forcibly seized critical farmland, port cities, stretches of coastline, places that were occupied and served a vital role in Palestinian life. Of course, all of this was perfectly legal according to very official pieces of paper, so the colonists could wave off the atrocities they committed to claim the land. One of these documents, UN Resolution 181, gave the settlers 55% of the land, which is made even more absurd by the fact that the UN had no legal right to do so and did not consult with the Palestinian people before adopting the resolution. Unsurprisingly,
Is this true? I thought the partition plan did involve Arab negotiators. Am I gonna have to dig into my book, my little book? As far as legal right, what are we appealing to legal rights? It was a General Assembly vote. Hang on. It's not as if there weren't offers that were previously made in the past, some of which were actually like for a binational state for Jews and Arabs. Unfortunately, both sides rejected the out of that. There was the 1939 Peel Commission, where the 1939 White Paper, where the British actually offered to severely restrict Jewish immigration right before before the like Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, before Barbarossa and the Holocaust. They offered to restrict Jewish immigration within a period of 5 years, down to 75,000 over 5 years, and then to stop it completely. And then on top of that, they also offered that there would be an Arab state within 10 years. They offered that, like Arab self-determination within 10 years in Palestine. And they offered it contingent on Jewish-Arab relations, like pending Jewish-Arab relations. And al-Husseini, the Hitler-loving shithead leader, decided that that was not generous enough because he wanted immigration to stop immediately. And he didn't want the state to be pending on Arab and Jewish relations. Like, that's probably the worst, I think. As far as like rejection goes, I think that's probably the worst example, because that white paper was voted down 6-4 by the Arab Higher Committee. It was voted down 6-4. But I don't know what you're saying, Zandana. I'm pretty sure the Arab Higher, the 39 white paper was voted 6-4. It was rejected 6-4. Despite the fact that most Palestinians seemed to favor it. They were there was like a lot of optimism and a lot of celebration in Palestine at the time when that white paper was involved, because it was basically Chamberlain literally said, if we're going to upset someone, if we're going to like things up for someone, we're going to do it we're going to things up for the Jews, not for the Arabs. I can find it here. It's on page 158. Let's see. Hmm. Whoop. Here. This was it here, right? They proposed a ceiling of 75,000 on Jewish immigration during the next 5 years, after which all immigration would require Arab agreement. The white paper put severe limitations on Jewish land purchasing, completely forbidding it in most districts, and proposed an independent Palestinian state with majority rule within 10 years. Arab-Jewish relations pending. At this point, the Palestinians made a major blunder. They never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity, as Abba Eban was later to point out. Having failed in the revolt, and nonetheless having been offered major political concessions, the AHC turned around and rejected them under pressure from rebels whose slogan remained, "The English to the sea and the Jews to the graves." The AHC was dissatisfied mainly because the white paper failed to call an immediate halt to Jewish immigration, and because independence had been deferred and made contingent on Arab-Jewish unity. The Nashashibi, this is the rival family to the Husseinis, the ones who are a lot more, I'd say, reasonable, I would say, yeah. Supported the paper, not pro-Zionist, by the way, not pro-Zionist, but still a lot more, pragmatically minded. Supported the paper, but Husseini won the AHC's support by a vote of 6-4. The Arab states accepting Transjordan closed ranks behind the AHC, despite the fact that most Palestinians appeared to favor the paper. Again, you can't really tell for sure because of polling and all that, but I feel like, again, these it's not a democracy at this point, so I feel like this was where they could have definitely used slightly more sensible leadership than Mr. Husseini. Also, just for both sides, Husseini was appointed by the British. He wasn't appointed by Palestinians. He was popular. He was a very popular nationalist leader, and part of his appointment was to appease the nationalist crowd. Yeah, he wouldn't have been made Grand Mufti if it was done according to the original, kind of feudal voting system. It wouldn't have been him. He came fourth. It would have been a Nashashibi. So... But yeah, this is Chamberlain here, right? If we must defend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs. The British, who are apparently violently assisting the Jewish colonization of Palestine. Yeah, it's so dumb. Fuck. Was Benny Morris pro-Israel or not? He's pro-Israel insofar as he's a Zionist. He's like a two-stater who thinks Israel has a right to exist, but he also supports, he opposes settlements and he supports Palestinian self-determination. Feudal voting. Yeah, as in only a select number of notables could vote, yeah. As in barely anyone. God, 3 minutes in, there's so much to... Ooh.
They were pissed, and war broke out. What followed is today known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Between 1947 and 1949, some 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their ancestral home. The Zionists seized 78% of historic Palestine, ethnically cleansed and bulldozed over 500 villages and cities, and killed at least 15,000 Palestinians in the process. Today,
so again, you can get into the weeds of it if you want. I get when they say expelled. If I would say expelled to 700,000, I think people know what I mean. I mean that some were directly expelled, others fled because it was a war, others left in part because Arab leaders told them to, or because they thought they could wait out the war and then wait for the Arab armies to come in so they could have a clear path to destroy the Jewish state and all that shit, or at least take whatever they want. When it came to some of them left because. Some of them left because, just because of the military attack. Some of them left because of demoralization. Even before the proper fighting was really taking off, a lot of the Arab elites were the initial ones to leave because they just decided that things were a little bit too. They feared a war coming because the Arab states rejected the partition plan. So yeah, they had already left, and then the fact that most of the elites had left basically resulted in economic crises within places like Jaffa and Haifa and Accra and all those other places, and that demoralizes the fuck out of the local populations. That was part of them leaving as well. But yeah, as far as direct expulsions, it's at least 50 or 55 villages or towns included direct expulsions. Other ones were people fleeing because they knew there was an IDF advance. Other ones were because of the stories about Deir Yassin, and definitely the exaggerated stories about Deir Yassin. So yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced in the way that he's putting it out. So, it's not a feudal voting system. The position of Grand Mufti is a religious position, so the voters were Islamic scholars, ulama. But I consider that feudal though, right? Is it not? Was it not because of the, or would you call that just like a religious hierarchy? I feel like that's more or less analogous to feudal, right? Anyway.
Today, settlers who were there at the time laugh about the atrocities they committed on camera.
עומדת כיתה של זה עם ידיים למעלה, אז באותו יום הייתי רואה אותי, הייתי קוצר את כולם, עד כדי כך.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים. ותראה, יריתי, נלחמתי כולם. אני לא יכול לספור.
Years from now, students will write papers comparing the Holocaust and the Nakba, and the racial animus that drove both genocides.
People do this. I've heard of history students doing comparing the Holocaust to the Nakba. What a fucking horrible comparison. I think even like fairly pro-Palestinian scholars, when they compared the Nakba was really, really gross, right? As far as proportionally as well, because it's 700,000 people being displaced and like losing their homes and their homelands and shit like that. And that's like half of the Arab Palestinian population. That's why the collective trauma like runs so deep, because it was such a high proportion of them. But as far as like the deaths, I think in the massacres, it was about just under 1,000 people killed in the massacres by the Zionist side. And I think for Jews who were killed in massacres by Arab troops, that was like something like 200 or 300. Total deaths, if you include all the military, it was like 15,000 in a war that lasts like just over like a year and a bit. I think everyone agrees historically that as far as not really about 13,000 civilians were killed, I'm talking about in the massacres. So I don't know if you're counting like a local, like an irregular as a civilian when I don't think it was 13,000 civilians killed in the massacres. Are you sure? I thought that was hang on. I don't think that's true at all. I think the number of deaths in the entire war, including militants, was like 13 or 14, 15,000. This is giving me the entire conflict. Weren't 800 civilians killed? Yeah, that's in the massacres, yeah. The rest would have been like through either during like the military campaign or in the fighting with soldiers and irregulars. Yeah. And I think on the Arab side, I think about 200 Jews were killed by Arab forces as well in massacres. Yeah. I don't know how many military casualties there were on the Zionist side, though. I think it was a couple of thousand, wasn't it? 1948 Arab-Israeli war. Give me the wiki. All right. Yeah, Israeli deaths was 6,000. 2,000 civilians, 4,000 fighters. Arab armies, yeah, 3 to 13,000, both fighters and civilians, yeah. So the massacres, I think 200 of these are in massacres at the hands of Arab forces, and about 700, 800, or 900 of these are massacres at the hands of Jewish forces. I think most people agree that compared to something like World War II or the Yugoslav War, as far as actual like war crimes and atrocities go, the 48 war was relatively low compared to wars of the 20th century, definitely compared to the Yugoslav wars, definitely compared to World War II. And that's on the Arab side as well. People try to say that the Arab side like committed this massively disproportionate amount of war crimes and they were like really gross. That's not true either. I think even the Arab side typically kept POWs and then gave them back at certain points. Like I think that was like typically what they did. I think the exception would be like Kfar Qasim. No, not fucking hell. What was the... Not Kfar Qasim. What was the kibbutz? Etzion, the Etzion block. That was the one where basically all 130 defenders were killed apart from like 4. Yeah. And most of them were killed whilst or after surrendering. But as far as the entire war goes, comparing it to the Holocaust? Do people know how bad battles and wars get? If you compare like massacres, say like the Srebrenica massacre in the Bosnian War, where that's like 2 or 3 days and you've got like 7,000 people lined up and shot and thrown into fucking graves. Or if you've got like World War II with the siege of Leningrad and the amount of civilians who died there. Or like I think in Stalingrad, you've got like 10 to 15, 20,000. Was it 15,000? It was like an obscene number of Soviet soldiers who were killed by their own guys for trying to desert. So when it comes to like the sheer numbers and the sheer like level of atrocities, then the Nakba actually came out as one of the least insane ones, or the less insane ones compared to the other ones of the 20th century. So comparing it to the Holocaust is fucking mind-numbingly stupid. Like, holy shit. Anyway.
And a lot of liberals currently both sidesing this genocide will nod very seriously and say, oh, we just didn't know how bad it was. Just like the good Germans did back in the 40s. It was bullshit then, and it's bullshit now. A lot of people think that the Nakba ended in 1948. It didn't. That was just the first major escalation of a campaign of complete extermination that continues to this day. When you see the Twitter posts saying things like there was...
Do you think the Soviet desertion thing is a myth? Oh. Are you sure? I think in Stalingrad it was 15,000, wasn't it? Wasn't that like a well-known thing? In any case, comparing the Nakba to like World War II shit is just, it's so stupid. When he says continues to this day, I mean, again, it's not like they stopped removing people from what had become the state of Israel in 48. They did actually, they barred obviously refugees from returning. They did clear out villages, and especially the Negev. There was a lot of clearing out the Negev between the late 40s and early 50s. They did go into places like, especially on the Green Line, like Kfar Qasim, and committed massacres and did like removals. So he's, and obviously people in Arabs who lived in Israel were like living under effectively military rule until 66. I know that now. But yeah, saying campaign of extermination again is so fucking dense. Again, because if it's a massive power relation and Israel is the massive fucking sophisticated colonial imperial power, how are they unable to stop the Palestinian population from growing if they're on a campaign of extermination? Like, they're on a campaign, you could argue, of like trying to claim territory and trying to expand their territory, and admittedly being given every excuse to by the behaviors of like neighboring Arab leaders. But campaign of extermination tantamount to the Holocaust is so it's so dense. Ugh.
Was a ceasefire on October 6th, realize that the people...
Yeah, apparently there's like the power relation is so acute and so pronounced, and it needs to be recognized that this is it's a defenseless indigenous population versus an overpowering imperial like powerhouse, but also their 75-year campaign of extermination can't stop the population from growing. Like, God.
Saying those things are either ignorant, in which case you can help them by providing resources, or are actively trying to obfuscate the truth. We know Israel has an army of paid posters to disseminate propaganda and shut down criticism online. Since the day the first European colonists set foot in Palestine, there has been a non-stop stream of crimes committed in the name of the political Zionist project. Palestinian homes are regularly and illegally demolished. Palestinians face arbitrary arrests and humiliating checkpoints just getting to school and back.
Do we also know that the budget for hasbara is like actually kind of like low, like that they've had to stall it over like lack of budget? This is in 2023. The amount that Israel spends on hasbara is actually not that impressive. Like that's actually why Israeli propaganda is so bad. Like that's why they always lose the propaganda war. But anyway.
Entire villages are ethnically cleansed specifically for recently migrated European and American Jews to build new settlements on Palestinian land. Again, these settlements are internationally recognized as illegal by international law, and this point is reiterated at every UN summit to no meaningful change. The Gaza Strip, populated by over 2 million people in an area about the size of...
Well, at least that's one relatively accurate representation of international law. I think it was in 2004, that was part of the thing about the wall. That the settlements were illegal. I don't think that's very controversial. If they're not illegal, they're immoral as shit. So I don't even care if they're illegal or not. But I'm pretty sure the argument that the settlements are legal is pretty weak, I would say. I don't think it's as blurry as things like 242 and 194 and shit, yeah.
Detroit is entirely cut off from the rest of the world. All entrances in and out of Gaza are controlled by the Israeli military. Imports and exports are heavily restricted, and employment opportunities are essentially non-existent. Nearly all water resources are undrinkable by design, and civilian infrastructure is regularly targeted by Israeli airstrikes.
But he says like by design. It's such a, oh my God. Like, again, why do people say this? Like, I guess that's the thing is if your narrative, it's a campaign of extermination. I guess you probably do believe that one time Israel just felt like closing in all of Gaza and controlling all the exits and entrances and controlling all the imports and ruining the fucking sewage system and actually not addressing the fact that one of the reasons that the infrastructure in Gaza was so is because one of their their treatment systems for water were enough for the population at the time, but now the population's grown, they haven't been enough. But the problem is that sending resources in to get new treatment plants for water is running the risk of raw materials being used by Hamas. Like that's kind of the problem. Also, yeah, like if it's about extermination, is Egypt involved in this war of extermination because they control the crossing at the south, and they've done the same shit that Israel has. So I guess like Egypt is complicit. Egypt is also part of the Zionist project, apparently, to exterminate the Gazans. Or would it be because Gaza has had a like very multifaceted relationship with Israel throughout history? Israel didn't really control Gaza at all from 48, 49 up until 67 because it was under control of Egypt. Israel would move into Gaza every now and then, and they would do raids, and one or two of them actually ended up in massacres as a response to Fedayeen attacks. That was one thing. And then between 67 and the 80s, you reached a point near the end of the 80s where something like half of all Gazans were working in Israel. Like they were going in and out of Gaza every day. And then you have like the first Intifada, and then you go up to where those work permit systems start to like rapidly decrease. And then you have Hamas coming in from 87, they become founded. And then by 2005, 2006, 2007, they are very, very prominent in Gaza. They win the election. They seize control over Gaza despite attempts from the Americans and the Israelis to remove them. And then the massive restrictions and the blockade and everything comes full-fisted. It's not like Israel did this for no reason. But I guess you can't really give that context, can you? Because it has to be like a campaign of extermination. Again, why don't they do this to area? Why don't they put the same kinds of restrictions on areas A and B? Why don't they tighten it to that degree in areas A and B? They do have restrictions in areas A and B, but they are nothing like the restrictions in Gaza because Gaza is a unique situation where they do actually have to worry about imports, not only of direct material, but also secondary material that can be used to make rockets or can be used to make weapons. Like Hamas brags about this. They brag about the fact that like if a fucking building gets destroyed by the IDF, they can like salvage the remains of that building, like whether it's wiring or concrete or anything like that, to make weapons. Yeah, we know that, or to build tunnels. We know that they do this. It's like, it's so uncontroversial, but I guess we're not gonna. I don't even know why you can't just make that point and then argue that it's excessive. There probably is. There probably are plenty of parts of the blockade that are excessive. Like some of the food imports up until 2010, around that period, were really difficult to justify. Like there were certain food items that they just like blocked for very dubious reasons. I guess they were worried about new importers coming in, and every time you have a new importer, you have to have new checks and new balances. But at the border before it comes in, but still, like, yeah, some of it is actually quite punitive, but it's assuming that all of it is not even punitive. It's just part of the extermination campaign. Wow.
Permits are routinely denied for the building of homes, civilian infrastructure, roads, sewage systems, and schools. Call it what it is, a concentration camp.
Hey.
If you force a population into an enclosed area, you control the food, the water, electricity, fuel, medicine, literally everything that goes in or out. If you put a high-tech fence around it with facial recognition and automated guns, if you routinely kill the people inside to further your goal of an ethno-state, What separates you from the Nazis? It's hard not to get angry when...
Oh my fucking God, man. Imagine if, like, because we know if someone said this to second thought and it's like they said it about the gulags, if you close people off, if you arbitrarily imprison people, if you put them and make them and subject them to hard labor, and if you don't, what separates you from the Nazis? Well, first of all, they would say that's double genocide theory because the Nazis weren't actually using those camps to gas people. The Soviets weren't using those camps to gas people. And then they're also probably saying like, oh no, that was actually the criminal system. You know, the gulags were actually just the standard Soviet prison system. And they were dealing with reactionaries and foreign agents and landlords, like people who owned an acre of farmland, those pieces of shit. Like, fucking hell. I think there are probably quite a few important parameters that separate that from the Nazis, right? It's not like there was some de facto Jewish government that didn't recognize Germany's existence and spent 20 years firing fucking rockets at Germany or like running or like launching militant groups from the de facto Jewish authority into fucking Germany to like go and murder random German civilians like in Berlin. It's not like that was happening, was it? Also, why would people do this? Like, people make these videos about how awesome and like pretty Gaza was before the airstrikes and everything. Would people do this about a concentration camp? Again, Gaza had lots of problems. It had so many issues with unemployment, with lack of opportunity, with the fact that they are closed off, with the fact that they're stateless, with the fact that they depend on foreign aid, with the fact that Hamas economic policy is incidentally kind of dog shit. They steal a lot of money that should go to the people. They have like a very, very oligarchical system where they just enrich the fuck out of their own leaders and who don't even live in Gaza and the families of those leaders. But it's not like Gaza was a concentration camp. Like, look at it. It's like, would people make videos like this about a concentration camp? I just don't think they would. Imagine like the fucking Nazis are coming in to attack the Warsaw Ghetto, and there are these montages of like, look how beautiful our existence was in the Warsaw Ghetto before these Nazi soldiers came in and started taking us to fucking Treblinka and shit. What the fuck? Auschwitz had a pool. Well, the problem is the people who make those montages about how Auschwitz had a pool, which it kind of didn't. It had facilities for the guards to use, but like the problem is the people who make that argument are the Nazis, like are the Nazi defenders. These montages are made by pro-Palestinian people, generally. I think this one's not. This particular one comes from Visegrad, but there are other montages like this that come from pro-Palestinian people, or it's like, I think this one might even be ripped from them.
when you're talking about this stuff, because it's so incredibly obvious who the bad guys are. And yet Israel dumps massive sums of money into pretending they're the victims. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a victim who can shut off their oppressor's food, water, power, and ability to move freely on a whim. So now I'm going to have to make an assumption, because I'm not going to waste my time.
Anyway, all this equivocating is messy, don't do it. I don't even know what you're referring to with the... Again, if someone... Let's assume that you buy the argument that Gaza is a concentration camp. I was like, okay, yeah, it is, sure, why not? Like, let's call it that. What do we do then? At the end of the day, what matters is what should be done about it. But I guess the problem is that people like Second Thought probably believe that Israel should just unilaterally withdraw from both Gaza and the West Bank, unilaterally take down the walls and all the border checks and everything like that, and just say, there you go, you're your state, we're not doing anything to do with you. And then just like whatever happens, happens, you know? Like if they decide that that's not enough and they want to, like Hamas says, if they want to do another October 7th, or if they want to do a billion other October 7ths, like the guy was saying, then they just do that, I guess. And Israel, like, just takes the consequences, right? You know? And maybe they're entitled to do that as well, you know, because there's still stolen land in Israel. Like, a lot of those kibbutz villages and a lot of those communities are built on top of, like, what a Second Thought would call ethnically cleansed Arab villages. Like, that's the problem, is you don't get into any kind of, like, realistic or any kind of reasonable solutions. It doesn't give you anything. It's just grandstanding.
time trying to win over people who still think Israel is in the right, when they've seen all the same footage that I've seen. Either you're a decent person or you're not. So the assumption I'm going to make is that if you're still watching this video, you're one of those decent people. We're on the same page. What's happening in Gaza is the most blatant example of genocide in modern history. For the rest of the video, I want to talk about what that means. What does it tell us when a country...
More so than Darfur? Like, more so than fucking Myanmar? Oh my god. Okay.
like Israel can commit these monstrous...
More so than Srebrenica? Like... Okay.
acts and face zero consequences, when it can be condemned by the vast majority of the world, including institutions like the UN, and get away with it. When we see this on Twitter, and the Western press still...
Does the Holocaust not count as modern history? Well, he said that the Nakba was comparable to the Holocaust, so he's physically insane. Like, he's just... he's... Going like Bangladesh and shit. Oh god, we got so many of them. Yeah, this guy is... like, every fiber of his fucking being is just, like, off somehow. I don't even...
still says that this is all Palestine's fault. It takes 34 seconds of scrolling just to get to the names of children 1 year old. To put the scale of Israel's crimes against children in perspective, in the final years of the war, when Germany was really ramping up their extermination campaign...
Would you consider Bucha a genocide? I think it's been classed as a crime against humanity because I think it came from... So I don't know. I don't know. Could it be? And I think it's that way because it was more kind of like sporadically allowed, those killings, the way the footage I saw from the New York Times. I don't know if it would come under a genocide. I don't think anyone actually accused them of it. But compared to even, like, Bucha was so, as far as a crime against humanity, it was so clear cut, right? You can see people going up to their commanders and then the commander just kind of making some hand gestures. And then they go to a bunch of people who are blindfolded and lined up and then just shoot them. Bang, 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 bang. Right? And then they just leave them in the street until the Ukrainians come and find them later once they've retreated. Bucha was so much more clear cut than anything we've seen from here, from Israel and Gaza, at least in my opinion. Clear cut in terms of like the intent of the people killing, like of the people doing the killing. But, or with like that theater that they literally drew out the word kids outside the building to let the Russians know that it was civilians taking shelter in the theater building in Mariupol, and Russia just direct hit it anyway. Like a direct hit, not fucking like bombing the car park or not bombing a building next to it and then like some collateral, like, and then it gets secondary damage. Nothing like that. Like actual fucking just pinpoint targeted. Yeah, shit.
The Nazis killed 127 children per day in Auschwitz. Israeli occupation forces are now killing 139 children per day. At time of writing, Israel has killed over 27,000 Palestinians in 4 months. Compare that to the 15,000 killed over a 2-year period during the Nakba. And yet, despite those numbers, despite the massive rally...
15,000 if we're including militants as well and army people. Why are we not comparing like this the Nazi military operations and the armies they were fighting with? What the fuck? You're going to compare like the number of people being gassed in one category, and in the other one you're going to compare like one army against 5 armies as well as a civil war. And you're going to use the raw death count. Like, what a absolutely brain dead way to count. Like, if we're talking about Nazi killings, like, how long was the siege of Leningrad? How long did that last? Like 2 years and a bit? 2 years and a bit, and you had fucking like 1.5 million dead. Like, 1 million Soviet civilians. Over one city. Over one... Fuck me, man.
Rallies for Palestine around the world, despite...
This is also like, if we look at the estimates for the siege of Mariupol as well, just that one city in Ukraine, we're not going to get the real numbers for that for a long, long time because it's under Russian occupation and Russia is not going to let anyone come in to count the bodies or anything like that. So they just have to go by taking aerial photographs of the graves that are emerging in and around the city. And even then, the estimates are going between sort of 25 and 75,000. Let me see. Where's the AP report on that? This is a really long article about this. I can't remember. Oh yeah, and then they've also decided to start renaming all the streets. This is the theater. Like, direct hit. Even though this says kids, like it says there are kids or children that are here. Yeah, Russians like naming all the streets, and they've announced like building projects to let Russian settlers move in to Russify the city again. You can see that on Google Maps now. Yeah. More than 10,000 new graves, the AP found. The death toll might run 3 times higher than an early estimate of at least 25,000. Oh, that's where they got the 75. And Russian plans to demolish over 50,000 homes. And this, again, is one city. What was the original population of Mariupol? But people like Second Thought just don't give a fuck about this, right? Because it's fucking daddy Russia doing it. Like, its population was 400,000.
Despite politicians getting shoes thrown at them and trade being disrupted, we still hear nothing from the corporate media. And we can't seem to budge the leaders of the Western world. Why?
Isn't today when Israel has to report to the ICJ? Yes, it is. Yeah, it's Monday, yeah. But I don't know if the report is made public today. And definitely not the ICJ's response today. That would be insanely fast, yeah.
The easy answer is that Israel serves the interest of the United States. Here's Joe Biden back in the 1980s.
There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make.
Whoa.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel
Jesus.
to protect her interests
Let's go.
in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
The U.S. and its vassal states...
I feel like points like this are just like they're just so extended because he's already made this little like stupid ahistorical case, and now everything's just like, oh well, now look what Biden's supporting now. Me. Hang on, where's the Mandela speech where he talks about the PLO and Syria and Israel? Where is it? Didn't remember it. Here.
In Geneva and others, that we carefully define what we mean by secure borders. We do not mean that Israel has the right to retain the territories they conquered from the Arab world, like the Gaza Strip, the Golan. They are fighting for the right of self-determination. I went further, however, to say that the support for Yasser Arafat in his struggle does not mean that the ANC has ever doubted the right of Israel to exist as a state legally. We have stood quite openly and firmly for the right of that state to exist within secured borders. But, of course, as I said to Mr. Sigmund in Geneva and others, that we carefully define what we mean by secure borders. We do not mean that Israel has the right to retain the territories they conquered from the Arab world, like the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. We don't agree with that. Those territories should be returned to the Arab people.
Mr. Mandela.
This dude's angry. Is that fucking Bibi? No way. Hang on. Because I know Netanyahu was always coming to these fucking talk shows. Like, there's no, wait. Is it? When he used to go on talk shows and shit like that, didn't he look a bit like that? Am I seeing it? Nah. This guy's mad though. But fucking yeah, it's like Mandela being a based fucking Mandela being two-state pilled. Ugh.
Depend on having strategic footholds all over the world. Israel is crucial in that regard, serving as a destabilizing force in the region, a useful intelligence outpost, a hub for Western personnel, and of course, a lucrative trade partner, especially when it comes to weapons of war. But
yeah, I see your message to them, don't worry.
Still, when the backlash is this intense, when politicians are being harassed wherever they go, when activists are shutting down weapons plants, blocking ships bound for Israel, when Biden's approval...
Well, blocking activists. Blocking ships regardless of where they're bound from, just to be clear, and kidnapping the crew. Like, I mean, what's happened to those crew members? Where are they? The Chinese, is it the Chinese crew? No, it's not Chinese crew. The Galaxy Leader. Where is the Galaxy Leader crew? Because I think the ship is still in Yemen. Shipping industry calls for the release of Galaxy Leader crew 7 days ago. Does no one give a fuck about this? This is activism? Where are they? Season the 19th of November. It's been a while. Like 3 months. Activists. Fuck off, man.
Approval rating is the lowest of any modern president. Wouldn't it just be easier to give some concessions? To give Israel a slap on the wrist and make them stop the worst of their atrocities for at least a little while? This is how normal people think. This is not how world leaders, fascists, and oligarchs think. Joe Biden, as mentally unfit as he is for the job, is still the President of the United States. He is the most powerful man in the world. Things like civilian casualties are nothing more than one of many pieces of...
What slap on the wrist does he want? No, he doesn't know. He doesn't know that Biden was actually, like, in part the one that secured aircraft carriers going into the Mediterranean to make sure that Israel and Hezbollah wouldn't go straight to war from October 8th onwards. That Biden was the one negotiating for that last humanitarian pause so they could allow humanitarian aid to go through. That Biden has been repeatedly falling out with fucking Netanyahu over humanitarian issues in Gaza, and he has actually been pressuring Israel to allow humanitarian aid in a way that it didn't seem like they were up for doing before. And also, you probably doesn't know that Biden has been putting sanctions on settlers, especially even for ones before October 7th who were committing crimes in the West Bank, for example, with the Huara riots last year. No, he doesn't know any of that because he doesn't give a fuck. Like, he doesn't care. Unless, I guess he just thinks the president can just like fucking, I don't even know, like, can you just unilaterally sanction Israel until they stop the genocide, until they do a unilateral ceasefire? Is that what he wants Biden to do? Because yeah, like I feel like anything a president can do will never be enough for someone like this. This is why people like Second Thought support dictatorships, because their idea of a good leader is someone who just does these massive, sweeping, uncontested, mental fucking moves that really don't have any guarantee of achieving any results, but just that, you know, they're doing something like massively disproportionate. That's the way this guy sees the world, right?
Paper that cross his desk on any given day. People hating him is part of the...
I think you're giving Biden too much credit, mate. No, I'm not. I think Biden can be doing more. But at the end of the day, if you have a population that you have to reflect the wishes of that population, it seems to be that most of the American population is still generally sympathetic to Israel. Like, you can only represent this so far. And as far as like, what exactly more do you want Biden to do with his like executive power, like as a president? Because I don't think he's going to get stuff through Congress against Israel, is he? With a 50-50 split.
The job. International crises are part of the job. He, like every other president, sees the rest of us as NPCs. Little Sims running around his country. We're insignificant. If we have a little red angry face over us, he can pull some levers and distract the majority of people with war over Ukraine.
Personally, the big criticism of Biden before the war would have been his lack of resolve on settlements. I don't know why American presidents always just like wag their fingers about settlements, but none of them ever actually do anything about it. Apart from, ironically, like Bush Sr. That was a good example, but what's he saying here? Sorry, I missed it.
His desk on any given day. People hating him is part of the job. International crises are part of the job. He, like every other president, sees the rest of us as NPCs, little Sims running around his country. We're insignificant. If we have a little red angry face over us, he can pull some levers and distract the majority of people with war over Ukraine or Taiwan.
I thought if we're talking about body count, the body count in one city alone, in Mariupol, might very well be higher than the one in Gaza. Why is that a distraction? What the fuck? How many settlers has he sanctioned yet? Is it double digits yet? Again, that's why nothing's good enough for you. I don't know. I think initially, on the day of the executive order, it was 4. And it'll probably go up depending on which that have committed crimes. Because I think the executive order was to sanction settlers who commit like grave crimes against Palestinians. I think the 2 settlers that he sanctioned, in particular, were 2 who incited the riots in Huwara, which I think is like quite fair. But I guess unless he's like actually just taking up like international vigilante law against every settler who commits crimes in the West Bank, like I don't know.
Even just ignore them for a few months. And this isn't to rag on the average person. Most people are busy. We don't have the time to get to the bottom of every geopolitical issue. It's just to say that when you are in a position of power, you have options to make your problems go away. And sometimes you don't even need to do anything at all, and the noisy troublemakers will eventually get bored and move on. What recourse do we have in a situation like that?
Good question.
It's easy to say, we just need to dismantle capitalism and destroy the perverse incentives that enable this genocide. But that's not a...
Is that the incentive? Is Israel doing what it's doing because of capitalism? Okay. Interesting.
realistic solution in the short term. I'm talking specifically about the US here. We don't have anywhere near the level of class consciousness needed to build a revolution. Not in a timely manner, at least. So we find ourselves in a position where it looks like evil has won. Where no matter what we do, Israel is still going to bomb Gaza, and the US is still going to give them the bombs, and the media is still going to say that your eyes are lying to you, and it's actually the Israelis who are the victims. That sounds pretty bleak. And it is. There's no denying that this is a pretty grim timeline. The United States is a tremendous force for evil.
Israel has a lot of important contract with American private corporations. Misha, you are fucking retarded. I'm sorry. Do you know how Israel has basically spent the last 2 or 3 decades trying to normalize relations with other Arab countries? And every time they try to, it seems to be, especially with the Abraham Accords, the big fucking wedge between them achieving that, say with Saudi Arabia, is their treatment of the Palestinians. When Israel aggresses on the West Bank or when they aggress on Gaza, their normalization prospects with the rest of the Middle East, with the very wealthy countries of the Middle East, goes way the down. I don't know why you think capitalism is motivating them to what? To basically turn themselves into one of the least popular states on the international stage, where basically all the people supporting them now are going to be like America and some European countries. And what is it? Micronesia, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Palau, Nauru, fucking the Finkelstein list of oceanic fucking countries, No, I don't think they're conducting war in Gaza because of capitalism. You fucking idiot. Eat glass. Jesus Christ.
World. There's a reason it's the most hated country on Earth. And there's a reason most Americans aren't aware of that fact. But here's the thing, and this might sound a little flowery at first, but bear with me.
Oh, don't forget the Marshall Islands.
Even though evil may seem like it's won, even though the US and Israel may seem impossible to overcome, there will come a day when historians can look back and soberly assess the crimes of these regimes as past projects. The US empire is on the decline. I made a video about that a little while back. It cannot sustain itself the way it has since the post-war years. The United States as we know it today will fade. It may not disappear completely, but its relevance will wane. Israel will go the way of Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa.
Uh-oh.
As long as projects like these are reviled and opposed by the majority of working people, they will eventually succumb to the weight of their own contradictions. And There's a fine line to walk.
I think in a way that when people talk about Israel succumbing to its own contradictions, that is actually kind of true, but maybe for a reason that this idiot probably won't never be able to elaborate on. There's a couple of main problems. One is that after the 67 war, Israel basically set itself on a fucking downward spiral when it came to their approach to religiosity and settler expansion. Because for some reason, with people like Moshe Dayan and all that, encouraging them, people in the West Bank after 67 decided that the West Bank was going to be theirs as well. And in a sense, they believed it beforehand, but then obviously with 67, they had the opportunity to go in there and build settlements. And lots of people opposed that. I think Ben Gurion opposed that. Lots of Israeli, pro-Israeli historians like Benny Morris opposes that. But they did it. They embedded themselves very, very deep within the West Bank, basically frustrating any kind of territorial contiguity that a Palestinian state might have, unless you're literally deporting hundreds of thousands of people. So the problem is that Israel has basically made the West Bank its problem, when lots of leaders, I think, rightly believe that it shouldn't be. It should have been there for a Palestinian state, and that problem is not going away, because the problem with Israel right now is this growing extreme right-wing religious Zionist group, and the problem with them is that they have lots of babies. They have lots and lots of babies, and they are outpacing the population growth rate of the more secular Israelis, who are more inclined or are more easy to pull over to more liberal or left-wing positions. So the problem is, and that the problem with them as well, is not only that they're pulling the country to the right, the other problem is that they don't enlist in the army. So Israel is simultaneously increasing its the aggression of its population towards the Palestinians, but it's also reducing the size that its military can be. And then that is a contradiction that is going to massively fuck Israel. And that's not even to mention them wanting to expand their claims into the West Bank being accelerated by this increasingly religious and fanatical population, is that they are also increasing the amount of territory that they will one day probably end up having to annex. And if they have to annex that territory, they're going to annex into that territory with it a lot of Arabs. And either they ethnically cleanse those Arabs, which will turn them into an international pariah, or they run an apartheid state, which would turn them into an international pariah. So it's there are a few different dimensions where Israel is absolutely f***ing itself, and in the future might actually just be sowing the seeds of its own destruction. That might actually be possible. Isn't military service mandatory? For some reason, there are religious groups that get exemptions. So no. Anyway.
Walk between this is inevitable and this cannot last forever. Assuming something is inevitable is not the...
Isn't annexation already the de facto situation in the West Bank under Smotrich? I don't know what you mean by de facto. There are parts that the right wing definitely wants to annex. There are some parts that actually have been annexed. People don't know. It's not just East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is annexed, but there are also parts of the West Bank, small parts along the Green Line, that are annexed as well. That is definitely where they want to go. Yeah, they do want to annex. They want the kind of the Trump plan, right? And somehow areas A and B just exist as literal Bantustan territories with autonomy, but not sovereignty, not statehood. Yeah.
Correct approach. That leads to complacency. But recognizing that evil cannot stand against the determination of the masses forever, that's inspiring. That leads to people getting involved, joining organizations, actively working to prevent things like what's happening in Gaza. Hope and determination is the right approach, not complacency. And certainly not doomerism. Yes, it's incredibly painful.
Massive rally for Palestine in Indonesia. Remember the CIA committed genocide here in 1965? They remember. I'm just so curious. Hang on. Trust in both China and the United States has clearly declined amongst Indonesians, but more negativity exists in relation to China. In policy areas typically seen as China's stronghold, economic investment is standing and declined relative to the United States. For example, when asked which country is most important for Indonesia's economy, 18% choose the United States, while 12% say China. 4 in 10, 42% are in favor of investment for the United States, compared to 30% with regard to investment from China. In 2011, the majority of Indonesians said China would be Asia's leading economic power, a view now held by only 31%. 21% fall, wow. 6 in 10 Indonesians either strongly agree or agree that Indonesia should join with other countries to limit China's influence, an increase of 10 points since 2011. The majority of Indonesians now agree that Indonesia is doing enough to pressure China to improve human rights. Attitudes to China. Where's attitudes to the United States? In a potential military conflict between China and the United States, 1% think Indonesia should support China and 4% think they should support the United States. Concern about foreign influence, 81% not concerned. More for China, but still mostly not concerned. I don't know, like every time these fucking people try to project their opinions onto like Asian countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or Philippines and all that, it's like actually it seems to be these countries either like America or they are kind of like a little bit ambivalent on America, but they like China less. It's I'm sorry, that's just funny. Fuck.
To watch the footage coming out of Palestine. Yes, it's normal to feel overwhelmed or helpless. But all you have to do is search the words Palestine March or Rally, and you'll be reminded that millions and millions of ordinary people just like us are making a difference. We're helping get food and medicine to people who need it. We're educating our peers. And most importantly, we're scaring the criminals enabling this genocide, whether they admit it or not. Another thing to consider is that even though
I'm sure Biden is very scared of JT Chapman. He's fuck me.
there are something like 40% of Americans who still support Israel.
Can you imagine a commentator like this in China, like doing the opposite thing? Can you imagine like a Chinese commentator or like even a Soviet commentator who has the same opposition to their home country that Second Thought has to the United States, like making YouTube videos like this and broadcasting? Jesus. He would literally get fucking drone striked before he even has a chance to like escape in his little cringe fucking sports supercar. Like, I don't even know. He's American. That's what I mean. And he's like this virulently anti-American, saying like the leaders are scared of us. Can you imagine if someone who lived in China, like a commentator in China, spoke like this about the Chinese government, like, and spoke in the way that they do about China's enemies?
That number is dropping. YouGopnik made a fantastic video a few weeks ago about the era of war crime influencers, where he talked about this bizarre need the occupation forces seem to have to broadcast their hideous war crimes to the world. I'm sure you've heard the quote, "Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake." The Israeli apartheid regime is making a mistake by not cracking down on their stormtroopers blasting their war crimes out on TikTok. No one on Earth can watch these freaks cackling about blowing up homes and murdering children without at least a little bit of cognitive dissonance. Even the staunchest supporters of Israel are squirming just a little bit.
No.
Except, of course, the ones paid handsomely not to squirm. Israel has shown the world what...
Jesus. Paid not to squirm. Me. What an assumption. I do really hope with that ICJ fucking... Yeah, also, what did this guy say about fucking... Do we need to look at it again? Whatever this guy said about fucking Hamas, like, murdering Israeli civilians? Jesus. I don't really know if the soldiers dancing, like, you'd have to, like, there's probably... I don't know if they're, like, are they saying that they're dancing because of, like, they're happy about war crimes? I don't know. Fuck, probably not. I'd imagine. There are some videos where IDF soldiers are being fucking mental. Like, there is a problem with that. And there is a problem with the absolute lack of repercussions from the Israeli government is really, really gross. Like, I really hope something from the ICJ comes out with that. Like, I know they said that they're trying to investigate some people who are advocating for genocide and all that, but one of the IDF's biggest problems is that if they really say that the worst excesses of the IDF are just that. They are worst excesses. Then nothing better would show that than just like actually coming down hard on people who break the rules. Because I feel like right now in the IDF or even in like for settler populations, like they feel like they don't really have, they really don't feel like they have consequences. Or if they do have consequences, they're like nothing.
What it represents. It stands for genocide, apartheid, ethno-nationalism, a fascistic desire to cleanse a land they believe belongs to them.
It's just him saying that. Well, it's just there's like these videos of people dancing. I don't know. Oh, God.
Ethno-nationalism, a fascistic desire to cleanse a land they believe belongs to them and build...
Like, see, that's a better example. Like, this guy is clearly just like gloating about the fact that people are fucking dying. So, yeah.
places and hotels on the graves of the indigenous population. No matter how hard the colonists try to erase the past by destroying mosques, universities, burial sites, entire villages, they can never convince anyone but themselves that they are indigenous to the land they are so callously destroying. Uprooting trees, salting the earth, poisoning the water. Native populations don't do that to the land they love. So, let them show the world who they are and what they stand for. Every video posted to TikTok, every piece of propaganda debunked. It will all go in the history books when inevitably this genocidal regime is relegated to the dustbin of history. The only way to ensure a bright and peaceful future in the region is to...
The dustbin, if it, like every... I feel the amount of times you read that in like Russian Revolution literature, people talking about resigning things to the dustbin of history. Eek.
to reestablish Palestine as it was before the Zionist project. A multicultural...
Actually, being good faith here, he's not going to show war crimes TikToks on his video hoping to monetize. It's the problem is that he assumes that every IDF soldier, like just filming TikToks, is doing it because they're enjoying war crimes or like wanting to, or like they're like happy about the fact that they're killing like civilians or targeting civilians or whatever. Clearly, there are some videos where you don't need to show actual war footage, but you can just show like TikToks that are captioned with people actually gloating about Palestinian deaths, because it's not like there's any shortage of that. But it's the fact that obviously Second Thought thinks it's like all the same, like like all Israelis are the same.
Cultural, multi-faith community with roots reaching far back into history. A beautiful past that should be celebrated, not bulldozed and turned into a theme park, not ethnically cleansed and its history rewritten to fit some modern myth. As much as evil will try to win, its own inhumanity will be its destruction. The world sees Israel for what it really is, and one day will remember Israel for what it really was. These days, it's pretty hard to find someone who will admit they supported Rhodesia or apartheid South Africa, but they're still around, pretending like they didn't act just like the supporters of Israel are acting today. So, what happens when evil wins? Evil doesn't win. At least, not forever. And the only thing that determines how long evil is allowed to persist...
I mean, it's not like the good guys... what happened to the Soviets and to Mao's China and shit? Like, did those guys win? I don't know. Fucking... Oh, God. One day, though, you know... One day, the visions of a guy who was writing in 1868 is going to overcome the modern world of 2024. One day, evil never wins.
Is us. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I recently launched a new channel.
Okay. Well, that was fucking distressing. I need I think I should look over the Destiny doc now so I can find some pro-Zionist talking points to get angry at instead. Oh God, we need to center ourselves, guys. Not in enlightened centrist way. I just mean center as in like return to reality. Because people like Second Thought, frankly, no one really has these fucking opinions besides like a fraction of a population in the United States of people who probably half of them don't fucking vote. And yeah, they're like, maybe at worst they'll join CP USA and go on holiday to Cuba and pretend they're doing activism. I don't care. Whatever.